Okay, now we pick up where we left off with a discussion of the somatosensory cortex, which is located in the precentral gyrus and essentially represents a surface map of areas of the body that bring information in via the spinal cord and the brainstem to our conscious awareness via the thalamus. This is where um, we initially receive uh, stimulus and we assign categories to it when we route this information to the somatosensory association area, which is just behind the somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe. There are special senses also, of course, that contribute uh, sight and sound and equilibrium and odor all have separate cortical areas um, where their stimuli are brought into the brain, um, visual information into the occipital cortex, auditory and um, odor information brought into the temporal cortex, and there are association areas that border those regions that are also used to assign categories to those stimuli. And then the integration of all these stimuli presents essentially a concept in the brain, which is then routed to areas in the frontal lobe where we decide what it is that we want to do uh, about these pieces of sensory stimuli. And you can see here that the sensory homunculus is not proportional to our normal body dimensions. We have overrepresentation of the face, of the hands, and of the feet, and underrepresentation of the arms, the legs, and the trunk. And the reason for this is that there are fewer sensory receptors in these regions. As a result, there's less area in the somatosensory cortex dedicated to these particular regions. Now, this map isn't hard and fast. There's considerable overlap in the somatosensory cortex, but we know most of this information from animal models and also from individuals who've had damage to the brain in those particular regions. Now, referred pain is a very interesting phenomenon. It's the sensation in one region of the body that is in not the source of the stimulus. In other words, you might have an internal organ that's in pain, but the sensation will be felt as if it were somewhere on the body's surface. The organ pain is usually referred to the skin, and both the organ and that region of the skin have the same input to the exact same spinal segment, and they converge on the same ascending neurons. And so what this does is it confuses the brain, and it interprets the information as coming from a region on the body's surface when in fact the pain is coming from an internal organ. So this is a nice little map um, for you guys to print off and keep in your home, keep near your other family medical records and such, because if you have pain in one of these regions and there's not an obvious injury, this can be diagnostic for a problem with a particular internal organ. For instance, you can see that the pain of a heart attack can be felt in the neck and down the left arm as radiating sharp pain. The pain of a kidney stone will be felt here in the groin and all across the abdominal pelvic region. The pain of the gallbladder would be felt in the right chondriac region and also up here near the right shoulder blade. So um, these are often indicative of problems um, that go on at the level of the organ itself. Could be an obstruction, could be a tumor, could be any number of things that produce pain in that region. But very important little map. Phantom pain occurs in people who have an appendage that's been amputated or a structure that's been removed like a tooth. And the reason that we sometimes interpret pain as coming from the missing appendage is that in an intact injured limb, pressure and touch sensation is thought to inhibit the pain pathway up to the brain. Um, and this is one of the reasons why rubbing a wound makes it feel better. This is why massage is effective in pain relief. But these sensations are lost with amputations, and as a result, we lose that inhibitory effect. So what's happening here is that this sensation of pain is actually being generated by the nervous system itself as opposed to an actual painful stimulus via nociceptor. Chronic pain is not a response to immediate direct tissue injury. Here, the cerebrum and the thalamus may malfunction and misinterpret discomfort as pain. The brain as a whole may not properly regulate how much pain stimulation is allowed to penetrate the cerebral cortex. Examples include migraines and back pain. These are often conditions that are associated with considerable psychological disturbance such as depression, helplessness, frustration, and so on. An example of a condition that is characterized by this type of chronic pain is fibromyalgia. Now, if we're considering how it is that commands get sent to skeletal muscle, what we have to determine is where, in fact, the intention to execute a plan begins. The motor system maintains posture and balance, and it moves the limbs, the trunk, the head, the eyes, the facial expression, and the speech. Reflexes are movements that occur without needing the input of the brain, so they occur subconsciously at the level of the spinal cord. Now, the brain does get information after the fact, but the brain doesn't have to be directly involved in order for reflexes to execute. Voluntary movements are consciously activated to achieve a particular goal, and there's two sets of neurons that convey these commands to eventually their targets, which would be skeletal muscle. The upper and lower motor neurons. The upper motor neurons run directly or through interneurons and connect to the lower motor neurons, which in turn leave the central nervous system and extend through the peripheral nerves all the way to the skeletal muscle. The cell bodies are in the anterior horns of the spinal cord. Remember, that's in the front, and also in the cranial nerve nuclei that are found in the brain stem. So what are the steps to voluntary movement? Well, the initiation of voluntary movement begins in the premotor areas of the cerebral cortex and results in the stimulation of upper motor neurons. And so a lot of this occurs in the frontal lobe. Essentially what happens is we decide on a plan of action, and what happens first is that that plan of action is essentially pre-read to the motor association area, the basal nuclei, and the cerebellum. The next thing that happens when the movement actually is executed is that those areas in the motor association area that have received the intention to act will send their completed plan to the primary motor cortex, which will in turn convey via the upper motor neurons the electrical signals that are going to descend through the brainstem and the spinal cord and ultimately out through the peripheral nerves to their targets. Now, along the way, as the movement's being executed, there's crosstalk between the basal nuclei and the primary motor cortex and the cerebellum and the primary motor cortex. And the goal of these pathways is to modify our actions so that they match up with our intentions. The idea is to coordinate the movement, but also to sync the movement with what we intend to do. So we have what we call the planning stage, and then we have the actual movement stage. So in the planning stage, we sort of send an outline of the program to the motor association area, the basal nuclei, and the cerebellum, and then when we execute that movement, the motor association area again moves that information to the primary motor cortex, which shoots it down the brainstem and spinal cord to the peripheral nerves. But again, as this is happening, this is modified on the fly by action that comes from the basal nuclei. Those are the lentiform nuclei, the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and so on, and the cerebellum. And their idea is that they want to match up what you're doing with what you're trying to do. The cortex interacts with the basal nuclei and the cerebellum in the planning, the coordination, and the execution of those movements. The precentral gyrus is determined to be the primary motor cortex, or the primary motor area. 30% of upper motor neurons are found here, another 30% in the premotor area, with the rest in the somatosensory cortex. And you might ask, well, why in the world would motor neurons be found in the somatosensory cortex? And the best explanation I found is that they serve, among other things, as mirror neurons, where they actually will fire and generate, perhaps not the full-blown plan of action, but at least an imitation of movements that are being observed by another individual. So they're sort of a direct sensory relay right to the muscles, and it's not fully understood why these mirror neurons are there, but they do in fact exist, and it is thought that this is one of their roles. It's a neuron that fires both when an individual acts and also when an individual observes the same action performed by another individual. So the neuron mirrors the behavior of the other as though the observer itself were performing the action. The premotor area is anterior to the primary motor cortex, and here motor functions are organized prior to initiation. And then, of course, the prefrontal area is where we get the motivation for the movement. This is where we actually decide that we want to do something, more or less. So this is the foresight to plan and initiate movement, as also is the seat of emotional behavior and of mood. Okay, so all this begins, as best we can determine, in the frontal lobe. And so what you're looking at here is just the motor homunculus. This is the motor counterpart to the sensory homunculus, and what you can see, again, is that the proportions on the motor homunculus on the precentral gyrus are not proportional to our body dimensions. The face and the hands and the tongue and the lips are overrepresented, while the trunk, the arms, the legs, and even the feet are underrepresented, and this reflects the degree of motor control we have over these regions. But it's pretty close to the sensory homunculus. Remember that it's separated from the postcentral gyrus by the central sulcus, and both of these ridges run right across the middle of the brain, just like a barrette. Now, the direct pathways, which are called the pyramidal system, are involved in the maintenance of muscle tone, the control and the precision of skilled movement. And again, these are descending pathways, and this information as it exits the spinal cord is efferent information. The indirect pathways are less precise movements, and it's thought that the extrapyramidal system is a more primitive method of motor control than the pyramidal system. Again, the reason we call this the pyramidal system is because many of these tracks make their way through the medulla oblongata, where about 85% of them cross to the opposite side of the body. Okay, so that's where the pyramids are located. That's where those tracks run through. And what you're looking at here is a diagram. It's a little hard to sort of figure out. I've got a better one that I'll show you in class, but it's essentially showing you how the direct and the indirect pathways work together in order to execute movement. But again, it works essentially the way that I described earlier, where we have decision making that takes place in the frontal lobe, and that information is moved via association tracks to the motor association area, and from the motor association area, that information is transported to the basal nuclei and the cerebellum as preparation for the actual movement. And then what happens next is that the motor association area will send the finalized plan to the primary motor cortex, which then, via these direct pathways, will send the upper motor neurons down through the brainstem and through the ventral spinal cord until they hit the secondary motor neurons, which are going to be the leads into the peripheral nerves that are actually going to talk to the skeletal muscle. But along the way, what happens is that the basal nuclei and the cerebellum are going to modify these movements so that they match with our intentions. Okay, so that's essentially their role in coordinating and in verifying the plan of action to make sure, again, that our intentions match up with our actions. That's the best explanation I can give you for this extremely complicated diagram. Remember that the basal nuclei are those areas of gray matter that lie embedded in the white matter of the brain. You've also got some involvement at the level of the brainstem specifically in the midbrain via the substantia nigra and the red nuclei. They also help coordinate these movements along with the basal nuclei. The thalamus, of course, is also involved in this. Remember that the thalamus is the gateway to the cerebral cortex, and so it serves as essentially a router to move sensory information up to the brain and also to bring motor commands down from the brain. So essentially, this is how the pathways are operating. So let's break down these pathways in a little bit more detail. The direct pathways control muscle tone and conscious, fine, skilled movement in the face and in the distal limbs. They have direct synapses of upper motor neurons of the cerebral cortex with lower motor neurons in the brainstem and the spinal cord. The tracts include the corticospinal tract, which directs the control of movements below the head. And again, remember that these tracts are named for where they start and where they stop. So the corticospinal tract is going to start in the cerebral cortex, is going to end in the spinal cord. And the corticobulbar tracts have direct control over movements in the head and neck. So most of the corticobulbar tracts are going to synapse onto cranial nerves that are going to innervate structures in the head and in the neck. Okay, so this is a fairly direct method of fine motor control. The corticospinal tracts contain axons of upper motor neurons that descend through internal capsules and cerebral peduncles to the pyramids of the medulla. About 85% of them will then cross to the opposite side and descend in the lateral corticospinal tracts and supply all levels of the body. The remaining fibers are going to descend uncrossed in the anterior corticospinal tracts but decussate near the level of the synapse with the lower neurons, and they'll supply the neck and the upper limbs. So again, we're going to have a crossover at some point. It's just that in the corticospinal tracts, in the lateral levels, we're going to actually cross within the medulla, and the remainder are going to cross at the level where they synapse with the lower motor neurons. But in either case, we're going to innervate the opposite side of the body from where the plan of action is being sent. The corticobulbar tracts innervate the head. The upper neurons enter the cranial nerve nuclei after forming the reticular formation. The lower motor neurons control eye and tongue movement as well as mastication. Remember that that's chewing, and facial expression, as well as palatine, pharyngeal, and laryngeal movement. So a lot of these are involved again with swallowing and with speaking. Now there's some indirect pathways that aid these direct pathways in coordinating and smoothing these movements. They control conscious and unconscious muscle movement in the trunk and in the proximal limbs, and they synapse in some intermediate nucleus rather than directly with the lower motor neurons. There are several tracts. The rubrospinal tract has upper motor neurons that synapse in the red nucleus. Remember that that's in the midbrain. That's that highly vascularized region that lies just behind the cerebral peduncles. And it's similar to the comparative function of the cerebellum in that it tries to match up intentions with actions. It regulates fine motor control of the muscles in the distal part of the upper limb. The vestibulospinal tract influences neurons innervating extensor muscles in the trunk and the proximal portion of the lower limb, and it helps maintain posture, while the reticulospinal tracts are involved also in the maintenance of posture. And you can see the rubrospinal and reticulospinal tracts indicated down here, and notice again that the level of decussation is going to be different depending on the tract that we're referring to, and the structures innervated are going to be different as well. Okay, so this is just representative of different levels of the brain. Remember, this is cortex, this is midbrain, this is pons. Okay, notice again the reticular formation here. Okay, and then you can see the medulla, and then down here we are synapsing in the lower motor neurons in the spinal cord. Okay, these pathways again are going to be slower because there are more synapses in them. Notice also the involvement of the basal nuclei, right? The lentiform nuclei here, which are involved in processing a lot of this information as well. The basal nuclei are important in planning, organizing, and coordinating movement and posture. They have feedback loops among the basal nuclei, the thalamus, and the cerebral cortex. So these all sort of talk to each other, and they edit our our outgoing motor commands again, so that our intentions match our actions. If they're stimulatory, they're going to facilitate muscle activity such as getting up out of a chair, and if they're inhibitory, they can inhibit activity in antagonistic muscle groups so that we can actually carry out the intended movement. If, again, sets of antagonistic muscles were to flex at the same time, no movement would happen because, again, essentially the muscles would tense and the joint wouldn't move. Now, the cerebellum is important because it helps us, again, to compare intended actions with what we're actually doing. So it also maintains muscle tone in postural muscles. It helps control balance during movement, and it coordinates eye movement as well. And what we can see here is sort of a list of how the cerebellum carries out its activity as an action editor. So what happens, again, when we begin the plan of generating movement, we hatch it again in the frontal lobe. We send that information to the motor association area, which talks to the basal nuclei and the cerebellum. The motor association area also sends information to the primary motor cortex, which is going to send information down via the pyramidal tracts to the lower motor neurons. But along the way, what's going to happen is that the cerebellum is going to compare what we're doing via proprioceptive and vestibular information with what we intend to do. So the motor cortex sends the action potentials to the lower motor neurons in the spinal cord. The action potentials from the motor cortex inform the cerebellum of the intended movement, so it has an idea of what we're trying to do before we do it. The lower motor neurons in the spinal cord send the action potentials to the skeletal muscles, and they move, and then proprioception comes back up via ascending pathways to the cerebellum and conveys information about what we're doing. Okay, the cerebellum is going to compare the information from the motor cortex with the proprioceptive information from the skeletal muscle joints so that our intentions match our actions, and then action potentials from the cerebellum to the spinal cord are going to modify the stimulation from the motor cortex to the lower motor neurons. The action potentials from the cerebellum are then sent to the motor cortex, and they modify its motor activity. So bottom line, again, is that the cerebellum can sort of send via the thalamus information that's going to modify what's coming down from the cortex, and that in turn is going to modify what's going on at the level of the skeletal muscle. And this is just sort of showing you, again, how the pathway works. Okay, you can see the numbers here. 1 is indicating the motor cortex sending the action potentials to the lower motor neurons. You can see over here that at the same time we're routing information via neurons, association neurons to the cerebellum. And then what's happening here is that the cerebellum is receiving information via proprioception from the skeletal muscle via the movement. And so what it will do is it will modify via the thalamus what's being sent from the motor cortex, and it will also modify via the red nucleus the coordination of these planned activities. All ascending and descending pathways pass through the brainstem. Nuclei from cranial nerves 2 through 12 are located in this region, and this is the site of many reflexes important to our survival, such as heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, sleep, swallowing, vomiting, coughing, and sneezing. The reticular activating system controls the sleep-wake cycle. It receives input from cranial nerves 2 and 8, okay, that's the optic nerve and the vestibulocochlear, as well as ascending tactile sensory pathways and descending neurons from the cerebral cortex. Wakefulness is maintained by information that comes from the eyes and the ears. Because of this information coming from the cerebral cortex, most alarm clocks function using sound waves to awaken somebody who's sleeping. Remember that there's a couple of areas of the brain that determine when we should be active and when we shouldn't be. The reticular activating system essentially allows the thalamus to let stimuli get to the level of the cerebral cortex. At the same time, you have to remember that the pineal gland has a role via the secretion of melatonin. So the endocrine system also has some effect here. And so what you can see in this diagram is just an example of how this works. Okay, we've got sensory inputs that are coming via the optic nerve, via the vestibulocochlear, the olfactory, the somatosensory. And what happens here is this all comes into the brain stem. This is part of the reticular formation that promotes consciousness. What happens here is that inputs from the cerebral cortex um, are going to be governed by the action of the thalamus. What happens here is that the thalamus, when it's time for us to wake up, is going to start to let this information make its way via the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. We'll then become aware of our surroundings as information comes in to the appropriate cortical area, okay, occipital, temporal, or somatosensory, or olfactory, and we will begin to become aware of our surroundings. Inputs from the limbic system also have an input here. Remember, the limbic system is our emotional brain. It appends an emotional content to the stimulus as we experience it. If we have damage to the reticular activating system, sometimes what results is coma and even death. Okay, speech is an area that's normally found in the left cerebral cortex. Wernicke's area is dedicated to sensory speech. That would be understanding what is heard and thinking of what you'll say. While Broca's area is involved in the execution of speech. This sends message to the muscles that actually make the sounds. Sound is first heard in the primary association area, then the information travels to Wernicke's area via neuronal connections between Wernicke's and Broca's, and that results in speech. Aphasia is an absent or defective speech or language comprehension, and it can be caused by a lesion somewhere along this auditory speech pathway. Again, remember that the auditory cortex is in the temporal lobe. Inputs from the cochlea come via the cochlear branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve into the auditory cortex. The auditory association area assigns meaning to that, okay, and then that information gets piped over to Broca's area where we decide what it is that we want to say. And here you can see an example of a PET scan showing you what's actually occurring when somebody is hearing and then responding. So you can see here a person is shown a word. The word is visualized in the visual cortex, which is on the occipital lobe of the brain. The information concerning the word is understood in Wernicke's area, okay, where we get, again, we attach a language concept to the visualized word, and then we route that information over to Broca's area, and this is going to cause the muscles that execute making the sound of the word to make the sound of the word, and then that information is transferred from Broca's to the primary motor cortex. The motor cortex, of course, is going to synapse on lower motor neurons, and those are going to make the muscles that generate the phonation execute. Okay, so that's what will end up generating the speech. Okay, so it's again from occipital to Wernicke, okay, primary auditory cortex here, to Broca's, okay, over here in the frontal lobe, and then from Broca's up to the primary motor cortex in the precentral gyrus. Now, in order for coordinated activity to go on, any kind of motor activity, the right and the left half of the brain have to talk to each other. They have to understand what's going on. The right controls muscular activity and receives sensory information from the left side of the body and vice versa. Sensory information of both hemispheres is shared through the commissures, and the major commissure is the corpus callosum. Remember, that's that big tract of white matter that connects the left cerebral hemisphere to the right. Language and other functions like artistic activity are not shared equally. Left is generally dedicated to mathematics and speech, and the right to three-dimensional or spatial perception and the recognition of faces and musical ability. Although this is not a hard and fast rule. This can vary from individual to individual. This is just information that we've gleaned from a variety of studies. An EEG is a record of the brain's electrical activity. Remember that all this is electrical information. The movement of charged particles across physical distance represents current, and we can measure that current via instrumentation that's affixed to the scalp. The summation of all the action potentials occurring at a particular movement sensed by electrodes placed on the scalp generates a particular waveform. That's the EEG that you see below. There are different brainwave patterns that are often indicative of different states of consciousness or activity. Alpha waves are found in a resting state with the eyes closed. So you can see alpha waves sort of here. These are alphas and betas. Okay. Beta waves are seen during intense mental activity. And theta waves occur in children, but also in adults that are experiencing frustration or who may suffer from brain disorders. Delta waves, which you can see down here, occur in deep sleep, in infancy, and in individuals that have severe brain disorders. So you can see that there's a very characteristic waveform to each of these different patterns. Sleep has a particular pattern of non-REM and REM sleep that alternates these different waveforms. And here you can see them sort of picked out. Again, note the alphas, the betas, the thetas, and the deltas. Again, the deltas indicative of deep sleep. And then notice how stages of REM sleep will come and go. REM stands for rapid eye movement. And it's thought that what's happening in REM sleep is that as the oculomotor neurons are firing, what happens is that the eye moves around in a visual field, and it's you essentially looking around in your unconscious dream state at what's surrounding you. And notice that we go through cycles. We go in and out of REM sleep, and it's thought that REM sleep represents the most restorative region of sleep, where we essentially get recharged and ready to go. And when we recover from REM sleep, if we've had enough of it, then we're conscious and alert the next day. If we don't achieve REM sleep, and they've done sleep studies to determine this, then what happens is that we suffer from mental confusion, from fatigue, and from irritability. And it's the same as if we'd never gotten any sleep to begin with. So this REM sleep is critical, this dream state. Now, memory is an interesting phenomenon. Memory is the translation from experience to learning to storing that learned experience in the brain in a way that it can be drawn on at a later point. Sensory information is very short-term retention of sensory input, while short-term memory is information that's retained for a few seconds to a few minutes, and long-term memory is declarative or explicit and allows us to retain facts. It's thought to be accessed by the hippocampus, which is where our actual memory relies, and the amygdaloid nucleus, where our emotional memory lies. Procedural memory is the development of skills such as riding a bicycle, and it's termed implicit or reflexive. Now, the interesting thing about these different forms of memory is that this information moves from one physical location in the brain to another. And we know this because there are patients that have memory deficits that are of specific types. You'll have people that have long-term memory deficits and people that have short-term memory deficits. An example of somebody that has a short-term memory deficit might be somebody with dementia, where they can recall what happened long ago, but they can't recall what's happening from moment to moment. Whereas somebody with long-term memory deficit would be an example of somebody, for instance, with amnesia. And we know that that's a different physical part of the brain. And we know that this information moves from working to short-term to long-term memory over time. And that's why we know that these locations in the brain have to be different. Now, that's not to say that they're in exactly the same place in every individual. There can be some variability. It's entirely possible. But we do know that there's a physiochemical mechanism that allows this information to be shuttled from place to place. A lot of working memory is lost right away. Short-term memory is often lost within a short time, whereas long-term memory um, tends to stay around a little bit longer. Some declarative long-term memory is lost through time, and procedural memory only loses a small amount through time. Procedural memory involves more kinesthetic processes than declarative memory. Declarative memory would essentially be um, the the ability to recall certain details, okay, certain facts, certain historical notes that you've stored in the brain as a result of study or of dedicating that part of the brain to retaining and tending to that information. While procedural memory uh, would be like things like riding a bike or tying your shoes or standing on your tiptoes. And um, it seems that a lot less of that is lost than in declarative memory. And an explanation for that, the best explanation I've heard, is that this represents a more primitive um, survival mechanism than declarative memory. Procedural memory um, can act in organisms that don't have an extensive cerebral cortex, for instance. And they still be able to, again, retain skills that would enhance their survival in, let's say, an ecosystem of some particular type. Whereas declarative memory is really something that's more um, thought-centered, fact-centered, um, and requires more input from the cerebral cortex in order to be effective. So one of the theories behind how this happens is potentiation. The amount of glutamate released by the presynaptic neuron may increase when we use a particular neural pathway over and over again. The glutamate binds its receptors and causes ligand-gated ion channels to open. This causes calcium to enter the cell. The calcium that enters the cell associates with the intracellular molecule calmodulin, which activates calmodulin-dependent protein kinase 2, which activates glutamate receptors. And the CAM kinase 2 also causes translocation of glutamate receptors to the cell surface, and this increases the number of receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. The idea here then is that you've primed this region of the membrane to be more likely to fire in the event that it's chemically stimulated, because the concentration of these ligand-gated channels has gone way up. So this is what we mean by potentiation. And so this represents a potential mechanism whereby learned information or experiences can be translated into electrical information, into chemical information, and in turn be stored in parts of the brain via changes in the receptor concentration in different neural pathways, making them more or less likely to fire and execute um, in the event that that neural pathway is called on again. Now, it's not to say this is the only mechanism, but it's certainly one that's had a lot of validity associated with it. Now, long-term memory comes initially from short-term memory. The end result is that changes in the postsynaptic neuron become more or less permanent. Some of these may be cytoskeletal changes. Most of these are going to be changes at the level of the membrane. A memory engram is a series of neurons and their pattern of activity, and it's involved in long-term retention of information, a thought, or an idea. Repetition and association of new information with existing memories assists in the transfer of information from short-term to long-term memory. Now, one of the things we have to understand about this is not only can we facilitate these pathways by changing receptors in terms of their location and their concentration on the surfaces of these membranes that are in these neural pathways, but also one of the things that we've noted is that the brain actually changes the number and the type of connections that it produces as we experience the world around us. Essentially, as we learn new things, new connections between axons and dendrites are created. How does this happen? We're not entirely sure, okay? But we do know that it does occur. And so the brain changes as it experiences the world around it. And this also may go a long way into explaining how it is that we acquire and then move information around the brain so that we can store it from one place to another. The limbic system is our emotional brain. It attaches an emotional component to the stimulus that we experience. It influences visceral responses to emotions, motivation, mood, and sensations of pain and of pleasure. It's also part of our basic survival instinct. It's involved in the acquisition of food and water, and also is vital to reproductive behavior. Pheromones are molecules that are released by an organism that have an effect on an organism of the opposite sex. We know that this operates at the level of the insect via the chemical trails that can be left by certain insects that will attract those of the opposite sex so that they can mate. Whether or not this has an influence in mammals is something that's been debated. It's thought that females release pheromones that can affect the menstrual cycle of women around them. The cingulate gyrus is part of the limbic system as well. Remember that that's that ridge of gray matter that lies just superior to, or superficial we should say, to the corpus callosum. And among other nuclei in this region are our satisfaction centers. So, limbic system, if you didn't have a limbic system or you had a malfunctioning limbic system, then you wouldn't impute an emotional content to your stimuli. If you smelled something like sewage, you would say that that smells like sewage. You wouldn't necessarily say that that smells bad or unpleasant. Whereas if you smelled perfume, you would simply say that smells like perfume as opposed to saying that smells pleasant. That's the best way I can describe how the emotional brain attaches that aspect to the stimulus that's around us. Now, as we age, the nervous system does not improve in function. We see a gradual decline in sensory and motor function because neurons die. Reflexes begin to slow, the size and the weight of the brain begin to drop, and we see a decrease in the short-term memory of most individuals, while long-term memory remains unaffected or can sometimes even improve. We also see changes in sleep patterns. Very often, as we age, we require less sleep than we did when we were younger, and it's not entirely certain why this is, and it hasn't been necessarily determined that this is either an advantage or a disadvantage in terms of survival. We just know that the circadian rhythms are affected as we age. They begin to dilate or contract depending on the individual. Okay, that brings us to the end of Chapter 14. Again, review this material as it will be covered on exams and PRS quizzes. And I will see everybody in class, and have a wonderful holiday.